Hi, I'm historical linguist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and on my YouTube channel for a long time, I've been making videos about especially my particular specialization in Old Norse language and related Germanic languages, Norse mythology, runes, that kind of thing. And one of the topics that I talk about all the time is the history of languages and the study of that, historical linguistics. And I was talking to my own fiance, Lauren, about the history of English a little bit. And well, you said to me, I think if I can rephrase you a little bit, that you didn't really know anything about the history of English.
Yes, I said, I don't know where English comes from.
Yeah. And I said, well, I can answer that question and maybe in the process make kind of a story for those who, perhaps unlike the beautiful and the brave Lauren here, don't want to admit that they don't know the story. So where shall I start?
Go way back.
Okay. I'm going to start the story with the discovery of the story. Okay. So in the late 1700s, educated Brits were active in India, right? And they noticed fairly early on, because back in the day, these fellows were all educated in Latin and Greek at Eton and Cambridge and Oxford and all that. They noticed that the prestige classical language of India, Sanskrit, was so similar to Greek and Latin that they largely could just about understand it, right? They could tell this language had something to do with Greek and Latin at a deep level. And so there was I believe he was a jurist in India in the 1780s, William James.
Jurist?
Might be Jones, yeah, like a lawyer, who put forward the theory that none of these languages were the ancestor of the other, but that they all were descendants of one common ancestor. And that was the beginning of historical linguistics, the realization that these languages shared a common historical ancestor that no longer exists. So let me show you a little bit about what they noticed. I'm going to use this beautiful fancy new Wanderer's Journal from Hackett Publishing. Inspired by you, right? This is your idea, journal, so that's appropriate. So consider some of what they noticed is you take a Latin word, and I'll just put this on the screen for our viewers at home. For father, it's pater. You take the Greek word, it's just about the same, pater. Take the Sanskrit, pitta. So you've got P's and T's in the same place, right? Okay, let's look at, what's another word that's different enough? Family words are generally good for this because they don't change very much, but then sometimes they do. So for example, with Latin, we have frater, brother. In Sanskrit, that's bratar. Greek actually kind of gets rid of this word. Greek uses adelpos, which actually literally means from the same womb. But so that's kind of interesting. But in some compounds in Greek dialects, we can actually find this word as prater. So once again, you have something really similar, but then in Latin you have an F, in Greek you have a PH, Sanskrit you have a BH. What's interesting is that in other Latin words that start with F, Greek will have a PH, Sanskrit will have a BH. These actually, there's a pattern to it. So when they don't line up exactly, when they're not the same, the pattern will always be the same between the deviations, if you see what I'm saying. So they realized in the late 1700s, getting into the 1800s, this can't be a coincidence. This comes from some common source. Now, when you put English into this, and other languages like English, the Germanic languages, I'll get to how those are related there's a little bit of a complication, and it was two gentlemen, Erasmus Rask, a Dane, and Jakob Grimm of the Grimm brothers, who noticed how to fit English and the Germanic languages into this. And so Grimm's law, or Scandinavians sometimes say Rask's law, is that there are certain regular changes that distinguish Germanic languages like English. So, for example, P's become F's, and T's become thus. So this is actually an exact correspondence. P, F, T, Th. You know, another word where that occurs, I mentioned the other day, the Greek word pater means feather.
Yes.
Because we were noticing in...
Pterodactyl.
Yeah, pterodactyl. Wing finger, feather finger, that's English feather. That's that regular P to F, T to Th. Or notice Latin dent, Greek don't. It's tooth. You have T to Th, but you also have a regular change in Grimm's law of Da to Ta. So their D's become our T's, their T's become our Ths. And then N's are lost before Ths in English. So this is actually, it runs through the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
If you give me a word in English, throw a word at me, and not something everyday, right? Not because we usually borrow complicated words. Give me throw a everyday word at me. For anything.
Bread.
Okay, bread. Interesting. Do I know the origin of the word bread? I know what it is in Old English. I know what it is in Old Norse. I guess I don't actually know what the Indo-European root of that is. Loaf is another interesting one, which is close to that. I can think of what that is in Slavic, but it's actually borrowed into Slavic from Germanic. Boy, that's interesting. Okay. So surprisingly, sometimes basic vocabulary, I can't instantly think of what the cognates would be.
Hair?
Hair. I'm trying to think of a cognate. That would be from something like care. Yeah, actually, that is probably cognate with, I bet that's from the same root as horn, and Greek keros for like a ceratopsian, a horn-faced one, a dinosaur, Triceratops, 3 horn face.
Get the hair out of that?
Well, because K's become H's in Grimm's law. So our H's are from old K's. So hair, the H would be from a K. So examples of H's from K's, English has hound, Latin has canis, like in canine. English has, what's another good one with this? Okay, Old English, so raven is from Old English, hraven with an H, that's Latin chorus with a K, Greek korox with a K, Sanskrit kakula with a K. All right, give me another one. We gotta show people one that actually.
I picked the wrong ones.
No, it's okay. That's fine. I am not God's gift to etymology. I think it's actually kind of interesting when when I can't think of it right, like that in itself.
Face.
That's from Latin. That's actually a direct borrowing from Latin, so it doesn't count.
Doesn't count.
Because notice we have our English word father, which is cognate with. It's from the same root as Latin, pater, but then we borrow lots of words with the Latin form, paternal.
Oh, okay.
Right. So you can borrow a word later from a related language that doesn't follow these rules, but our basic inherited vocabulary is more likely to be native and then have cognates with those languages.
Okay.
Let's see if we can get to one.
You want me to pick one? I thought bread was a good one.
Bread is, it seems like it should be.
Foot.
Okay, foot is an excellent one. Thank you. Okay, so this is one I can definitely do. So in Latin, the root is ped. In Greek, it's pod. So think pedestrian or podiatrist, right? A foot doctor. Okay. All right. P's become F's, just like pater, father. D's become T's, just like dent, tooth. Foot is exactly cognate. That is, it's exactly equivalent, derived from the same thing as Greek poet.
Okay. I'm seeing it.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to try another one, or are you tired of this exercise?
You're tired.
Okay. But in principle, the basic inherited, i.e. native vocabulary of English you can do this with. So for linguists, a lot of the time, what we're taught to do, when I say in a video that, I've studied 100 languages or something, that's not necessarily to say that I have, engaged in conversations in 100 languages with someone, but that I've studied the way they're derived, right? I can predict the form of words in that language without necessarily being able to have a regular conversation with you in them, right? Very often that's the case with linguists. We're more mechanics than drivers often. Although typically to be a good mechanic, you have to be a driver of some cars.
Makes sense.
Yeah. All right. It's a good break point. For those of you following along at home, let me give you a quick word about my friends and partners in Grimm and some cool publications upcoming like this one. I share a lot of free information on this channel, but I don't want to just give you the information that I have found in a career of seeking it. I also want to give you the tools for finding and evaluating that information yourself. I am not the ultimate arbiter of truth, but I can give you the tools to arbitrate truth yourself. So if you would like to evaluate my claims about Old Norse language and literature, I will teach you more, give you more in your own toolbox in Old Norse language and literature in my Old Norse Zoom classes. There is my elementary Old Norse class in which I will take you from maybe knowing nothing at all about languages in general, or Old Norse specifically, to reading Old Norse prose with the help of resources easily available online. You'll read texts like this one and realize the cognates that make words more recognizable, right? Heimar is home, stein is stone. You'll find that most words in Old Norse that have an A sound in them have an O in English. You start picking up on patterns like that and it makes it much less intimidating to approach. I also have my Volaspá and Havamal word-for-word classes in which we read those texts with an absolutely fine-tooth comb. You don't have to know Old Norse yourself, but I will look at the Old Norse text and I will tell you word by word what I see there, different interpretations, different evaluations, let you draw your own conclusions about those two most important texts of Old Norse myth. And if you already know some Old Norse and you want to read, I have my guided reading club. Next, we're going to be reading the saga of Gisli Sorsson in its entirety. Come if you have a little bit of Old Norse reading knowledge or a lot. And also on Patreon from time to time, I'm offering some reading sessions in Old Norse for those who don't have the time to practice as consistently as we do in Reading Club. So check out the pinned comment below for links to how to enroll in those Zoom courses, and I'll hope to see you there. Let me just interrupt this video for a minute to tell you about my friends and partners at Grimmfrost.com. These guys have been in the business for a really long time, and they really care about getting the history right. They even get runes right, and I've done some of the runes for some of their products. If you're interested in historically authentic Viking Age products, that is the place you want to go. So that's sort of the long and the short of how we know these languages are related. They come from a common ancestor. I have other videos that go into more detail about this, about Grimm's Law, about the regularity of sound change, probably about how, there's a video called like How We Know Languages Are Related, things like that. Okay, but then what is the story that they discovered, right? Once you take these changes, these correspondences that we know about between these languages, and you roll them back to a common ancestor, what can we say about that common ancestor? What's the start of the story? So the ancestor of most languages of Europe and Iran and northern India, not southern India, go back to a common ancestor. And linguists conventionally call that common ancestor Proto-Indo-European, i.e. the proto-language for most of India and Europe. Right? It's a pretty simple name. We have no idea what they called it themselves. Anyway, what languages come from this ancestor language? There are reasons to believe, because of vocabulary as well as genetic research, that Proto-Indo-European was spoken around the Black Sea in what is today Ukraine and the steppes of Russia in that area, and that it expanded from there with a culture that is known to archaeologists as the Yamnaya. Now, the Yamnaya absolutely explode out of that steppe region, going both west and east at just about the right time. They're also some of the earliest people to use the wheel, to use the horse, to ride the horse, I should say. And they're very warlike. And their male genome also substantially replaced the male genome, as I understand it, the male side of, I'm not a geneticist, but I've interviewed a bunch of them, so go check out some of those interviews, throughout Europe and northern India. So it looks like they very aggressively dominated the previous residents of those areas.
Interesting.
Yeah, and brought their language with them. But that language started to split. And we usually distinguish 10 subgroups descended from the Proto-Indo-European language. So what happens is, over time, people who aren't in communication anymore, but originally speak the same language, their language changes in small ways each generation. And over a few generations, that gets really noticeable. And then after, a couple hundred years, you start to get a situation where you're really talking about different languages. And after 1,000 years, you definitely don't understand each other anymore. This is still happening today. Language is still changing, and it's still changing in a regular way. So just to pause with this for a moment, I pointed out that the P's in other Indo-European languages are F's in Germanic languages like English. Okay, that kind of regular sound replacement is happening right now. I am a living fossil, as you know, like the sequoias over in Florida.
And love. And love. I know, and love.
Sweet of you. And I still say things like what, where, when, while, etc., right? Very few people say this anymore. But go back and listen to recordings of American English in the 1940s, right? You hear radio announcers saying, when our boys get to your, they say it. It was a normal part of American English, right? My grandparents said it very unselfconsciously. I am certain that I got it because I identified with my grandparents so much. Right?
Yeah.
Although my mom does do it, so it's possible I got it through my mom, but my brother and sister don't do it. Okay. But notice that even though the sound is disappearing in American English, it is always replaced by a W, right? It is not randomly replaced by other sounds. So I say what, where, when. You say what, where, when. You don't say mut, nair, fin. See what I mean?
Yeah.
It's routinely, regularly replaced. So what happens is you get, just a couple of those every generation, especially in a society where people don't read. So they don't actually have something to compare their language to except what they hear. You can actually fairly quickly, like within a few hundred years, get to a situation where people don't understand each other anymore.
That makes sense.
So consider, on a nearer level, consider German and English. These languages actually 2,000 years ago, same language. But now I can't speak English to someone who only speaks German, and vice versa. But if you go back 2,000 years, the word for day in both these languages was dog.
Mm-hmm.
Now in English, that G's become a Y. In German, that D's become a T. They also pronounce G's at the end of words now as K's. We pronounce this vowel differently because of the great vowel shift. So 2 changes, and we get day and ta, which used to be the same word, dog. 2 changes, right? It doesn't take that much to make 2 different languages. Okay, but Proto-Indo-European, what languages come from it? The earliest written languages that are Indo-European that we know of are the Anatolian languages. These are spoken in what's now Turkey. So the earliest written, as far as we know, the earliest written Indo-European language is Hittite. And that we have written records of Hittite going back to 1700 BC. Hittite is now extinct, but Tony Yates, great friend and a great friend of the channel, who's been on the channel talking about this quite a bit, is one of the world experts on Hittite. And it is interesting to note that you would understand some Hittite 3,700 years ago if you were lost in the desert in Anatolia, what's now Turkey, and you had cried out for water. A Hittite speaker would have understood you because the word for water is water.
Oh, interesting.
Right? Basic vocabulary. And fascinatingly, English and Hittite both have very little change on any of the sounds in that word. It's Greek hudor, that's the same word, but actually it looks more alike in English and Hittite by coincidence. But you actually could have called that for water and a Hittite speaker would have understood you.
Very nice.
Yeah, kind of weird. The language of the city of Troy was Anatolian. It was a language called Luvian, so that's another Anatolian language. But the Anatolian languages went extinct. Probably the last ones that were spoken went extinct during the Roman Empire. There was also Tocharian, another extinct branch. These languages were spoken in, how to put it, the northwestern part of what today is China. So East Turkestan is a term for that. I believe the Chinese term is Xinjiang, something along those lines. It's been extinct for about 1,000 years, but we have some written records of it from about 1,000 years ago. So actually that far away, there were Indo-European languages spoken, and potentially further away, and they just never got written down.
Yeah.
Then we have Indo-Iranian, which is split further into Iranian and Indic. So in northern India, the ancient language is Sanskrit in its oldest form. We find it in the Rig Veda, that's Vedic Sanskrit. Amazingly, actually, Vedic Sanskrit was not preserved in writing. The language of the Rig Veda is about as old as Hittite, but it's only preserved in writing from about 1200 AD, right? Thousands of years actually after it was spoken, because it was preserved, I was about to say religiously, literally religiously, by people memorizing it. And so even though their spoken language wasn't that anymore, it was a matter of religious devotion to memorize it in its original form, in its original language. So it actually preserves a form of the language, what is that, I guess, 3,000 years older than people were speaking. It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But then the languages of northern India, Hindi, Bengali, are derived from Sanskrit or something very like Sanskrit. Urdu is also derived from that. And then there's Iranian, the other branch of Indo-Iranian. So we have Avestan, the language of the Zend-Avesta, the sacred language of the Zoroastrian religion, sacred text of the Zoroastrian religion, the pre-Islamic religion of Iran. And then, of course, modern-day Persian or Farsi is derived from that, as are Dari and Pashto in Afghanistan, as are Kurdish, are also Iranian languages in a linguistic sense, not politically Iranian. Not all of those are derived from the same ancient Iranian language, but those are all part of the Iranian group. Then there's Greek, which of course is Greek. We have really old records of Greek, actually, in a different alphabet than the Greek alphabet that we know later. In fact, it's not truly an alphabet, it's a syllabary called Linear B. Some of that goes back to, I believe, about 1200 BC. It's pretty ancient. And then we have the Greeks adapting the Phoenician alphabet into what we know is the Greek alphabet, or the many varieties of what we know as the Greek alphabet, around 800 BC. Greek is its own thing. It's its own branch, including the ancient varieties and the modern varieties, although it is particularly close to Armenian, oddly enough. There are a lot of sound changes that make Armenian and Greek not look very similar, but they are, in fact, at a deep level very similar to each other. Then there's Italic. And so Latin is part of the Italic branch. There were also other ancient Italic languages that are all now extinct. The modern Romance languages, of course, are surviving descendants of Latin and are therefore Italic. So you've got, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French. One that surprises people is Romanian, is in fact a Romance language descended from Latin. Sardinian, on the island of Sardinia, politically Italy, but not linguistically Italian, is its own Romance language. Some cool stuff like that. Then there's Celtic, which is close to Italic originally. we often associate, this is actually part of how this conversation started.
Mm-hmm.
We often associate the word Celtic today with, with Ireland, with Scotland. Maybe people think of Scotland, and that's about it. That's slightly ironic because actually the two still most spoken Celtic languages are not Irish and Scottish Gaelic. They're Welsh, which has about 500,000 speakers, and Breton in northwestern France, which has about 500,000 speakers. Then there's Irish and Scottish Gaelic as well, but actually they have fewer speakers than Welsh and Breton. But even though those languages are on the northwestern edge of Europe, Celtic was once spoken all over Europe. We have Celtic speakers, of course, in France, the Gauls. There was a Celtiberian spoken in Spain. There were the Galatians of the New Testament who were Celtic speakers in Anatolia, again, what's now Turkey. So Paul's epistle to the Galatians was written to a people in modern-day Turkey who spoke a language related to the language spoken then in modern-day France, and neither area speaks a language related to that anymore. All right, the linguistic map of the past is often very different from the map of today. Now, we often associate Celtic with Britain, but English is not Celtic. But I'm going to come back to focus on English. Okay. How many branches have it done? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so there's also Albanian. We only have written records of Albanian starting in about 1600 AD, but it's its own branch. It's quite separate development from all the others. Also, you'll be surprised if you look at the comments, because you look at the comments more than I do. There will be people who will share really hateful threats because I just said that there is no Albanian attested before about 1600. This is a weird fixation some people have.
No, all your fans are nice.
The fans are, maybe. I'm not talking about the fans. There are earlier languages that seem to be Indo-European written down in that area. We cannot definitively connect them to Albanian. At any rate, it's a weird...
We got 10?
Okay, we're at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right. Then there's Balto-Slavic, which is split into Baltic. That includes Lithuanian and Latvian. Lithuanian is probably structurally the language spoken today that is still the most like Proto-Indo-European. So congratulations, Lithuanians. And then there's Slavic. Slavic is broken into a East, West, and South group. The South group includes, for example, Serbian, Croatian, Bulgarian, Macedonian. The East group, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian. The West group, Polish, Czech, Slovak. And of course, there are a lot of extinct languages in these groups too. The Slavic languages only start to split up about 1,000 years ago. They're still fairly close to each other, mostly structurally and in vocabulary. You can really see the relationship. And then between Balto-Slavic and Celtic, and actually geographically between on my little chart here, and also probably historically kind of between, we have the branch of languages we call Germanic. Now, that does not mean from Germany. People often misunderstand the word Germanic as meaning German. It is actually not even named for German. The Germans do not call their language German, they call it Deutsch. This is because the Romans called the barbarians north of them, the Germani. Right? So we call the language of Germany German. Anyway, it's called Germanic for different historical reasons than we call Deutsch German. Isn't that kind of weird?
Yes.
Yeah. We could equally call it English or Scandinavian, but it's called Germanic. Okay. Germanic is at a deep structural level a little more like Balto-Slavic. Clearly, early speakers of Germanic also were interacting with early Celtic speakers too. There's a lot of really early vocabulary borrowed from Celtic. A lot of it very important cultural vocabulary. The word for iron, for example, that's originally a Celtic word. The word cart is a Celtic word, right? Actually, it's kind of funny because I pointed out cuz become huz in Germanic.
Mm-hmm.
Cart is the exact same word as horse. They come from the same root. The ha and ka.
Mm-hmm.
Horse is the native word. It's a vehicle.
Oh, that makes sense, actually. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The horse and the cart that it pulls, come from the same Indo-European root in ker.
Okay.
All right, Germanic has three main branches. There's an east branch, which is where we get one substantially written language, Gothic, the language of the Goths who overran the Roman Empire in the enlisted in and then overran the Roman Empire in the 200s, 300s, 400s AD. They were converted to Christianity in the 300s, and so their bishop Wulfila translated the Bible into Gothic, and that is the earliest substantial text. There are earlier runic texts, but this is the earliest large text that we have in a language closely related to English. It's pretty cool. Then there's North Germanic. That's Scandinavian. So we have the language of runestones before about 700 AD. We have runestones in Scandinavia beginning as of 2 years ago. There's one that dates potentially as old as 50 BC. It's the oldest one known, and therefore nearly the oldest writing in a Germanic language. There's some writing by people from outside the area of names and stuff. But beginning at about 50 BC, we have writing in Proto-Norse and runes. That period lasts until about 700. After that, we call the language Old Norse. And by about 1300, Old Norse is broken up clearly, distinctly into the ancestor of the modern Scandinavian languages. Icelandic, Norwegian, and Faroese on the western end, Swedish and Danish on the eastern end, from Eastern dialects. And then Icelandic, Norwegian, and Faroese are from Western dialects, as is the language of Shetland, the very northernmost islands of the British Isles. Grammatically, the local language in Shetland actually derives mostly from Old Norse, although their vocabulary derives mostly from Scots. As to Scots and English, we are part of the West Germanic group, which is a big spectrum because the furthest away languages in the West Germanic group, even though we share some structural similarities with them, and I'm thinking of German, actually in some ways are more distinct from English than North Germanic is. English is a little bit positioned between West and North Germanic. But at the southern end of West Germanic, we have Old High German, which gives rise to Modern German. Then we have Old Low Franconian, very little of that preserved, that gives rise to Dutch. Old Saxon, which gives rise to the language of Northern Germany, Plattdeutsch, Low German, which is actually more distinct from High German than it is more like English than it is like High German, weirdly. Then there's Old Frisian, spoken on islands off the coast of the Netherlands, and modern day Frisian, still spoken by about 500,000 people in the same area. That's the closest related language to English. Famously, you can make up sentences that are the same in English and Frisian to this day. Good butter, good bread, and good cheese is good English and good Friesk. Is a famous sentence you can make this identical. And then there's English. So, I mentioned English is not related to Celtic languages. Well, it is, because they're all Indo-European, but they're not from the same branch. As the Roman Empire crumbled in the early 400s AD, the Germanic-speaking peoples on the continent took notice, right, and often were participating very actively in the destruction of the Roman Empire. And a group of tribes, including, most famously, the Angles and Saxons, hence the term Anglo-Saxon, migrated across the sea from what is today southern Denmark, northern Germany, the islands off the coast of the Netherlands, where to this day the closest languages to English, like Danish, Dutch, and Frisian, are spoken. And so they enter southeastern Britain, where presumably the local language is something close to the ancestor of Welsh at this time. Although potentially, since that was part of the Roman Empire, there might have actually been a Romance language developing in Britain too. We don't know that, but there could have been. And apparently there was also a plague in Britain at this time, and so the population of the Celts that the early English found there was very weakened, and so they pushed the Celts westward into Wales and Cornwall and Scotland. And it is the Germanic language they brought with them, more like, again, Danish or Dutch, very, very unlike Welsh or Gaelic, that gives rise to English. And so when they get to England in the 400s AD, we call that language Old English. I mean, at that point, it's so archaic, you could speak of like Proto-English. We start to get a lot of texts in Old English after they convert to Christianity. So starting in the 700s AD, we get substantial texts in Old English. You know, the most famous is Beowulf.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then the Norse invade. So people speaking a North Germanic language, fairly close to English still, invade actually from the same direction and in the same eastern parts of England that the Angles and Saxons have originally showed up in. And they both fight with and intermarry with the English that they find there. And so English has a huge amount of Old Norse vocabulary. Now, again, Old Norse and Old English are really similar, but we still borrow a lot that's distinctively Old Norse. So some of our most basic words are from Old Norse rather than from Old English. Get, take, give, those are Norse words.
I didn't know that.
Husband is a Norse word, wife is an English word. Right. Brother is an English word, and sister is a Norse word. If we had the native English word, we'd expect it to be Schwester, like German Schwester. And then they, them, their, that pronoun is from Old Norse. If we had kept the Old English version of it, we would probably be saying he, him, her for they, them, their. That sounds too much like he, him, and her.
Mm-hmm.
So speakers apparently are like, hey, our neighbors say this, it's a lot easier, and people just sort of pick up a sort of easier term from Norse. But that's actually a basic word from Old Norse. You say every minute, right? That's from Old Norse þeir, þeim, þeirra, which are still the same words in Icelandic. Then there's the invasion by the Normans, of course, famously in 1066. The Normans are descended from actually Norse settlers in northern France too, but they've given up Old Norse and now they speak a northern dialect of French, Norman French. And so English then incorporates a ton of Norman French. The fact that these people speak Norman French, not Parisian French, is part of why we pronounce words borrowed from French differently than French people do today. We actually borrow them from a different dialect of French than the dialect that becomes the standard dialect of French today. That's why we say chair and the French say, terrible at pronouncing French, but chaise, right? Like chaise lounge. That's actually an old dialect difference in France.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So when people say English has a lot of French in it, it's actually a very different French than the French that you're usually talking about if you're, reading a travel book for visiting Paris or Nice or something. The printing press comes to England in 1476. That is usually, okay, so the Norman invasion is usually when people start talking about Middle English. English is no longer a somewhat isolated Germanic language, although it's not totally isolated because it's interacting with another Germanic language, Old Norse. It's now kind of getting incorporated into the mainstream of European languages, heavily influenced by Latin and by descendants of Latin like French. In 1476, we start talking about modern English. That's when the printing press comes to England.
Okay.
That also slows down language change. As more people become literate, they have something to compare their spoken language to. So notice if you read Shakespeare, it's 400 years ago. He uses a lot of words we don't use anymore, but it's recognized by the same language. You can read it. Chaucer is closer to Shakespeare in time than Shakespeare is to us, but Shakespeare probably would struggle in some ways to read Chaucer. We certainly struggle usually to read Chaucer. The printing press, and now probably mass media even more so, slow down that language change process. And English continues to evolve, but not quite as much as, you can see a lot more change from, Beowulf to Chaucer to Shakespeare than from Shakespeare to us. This is also part of why there are more dialects in the British Isles than there are in the Americas, right? You and I talk a little bit differently, right? We're from, what is that, 2,500 miles away from each other, maybe?
Yeah.
But imagine, like, you're in England, 2,500 miles away is probably like Constantinople in the Middle Ages, right? So they've had more time for, and especially in a pre-literate society, small differences in different areas to add up. So that's why there's a bigger difference between someone speaking a local dialect from York and someone speaking a local dialect from Kent than there is someone speaking a local dialect from New York, New Jersey, and someone speaking a local dialect from Colorado. That's Colorado influenced by really old Texans. So, how's that?
This is fantastic. Actually, it pulls together a lot of different interviews that I've heard now. I understand a little better with this base. So I'm glad I asked.
Touch. Are there further questions you would ask? Stones I left unturned here. I mean, obviously, this is supposed to be a basic intro. And I thought it was fun taking the time to explain to you.
Yeah.
Because, there's no harm. No one teaches this stuff.
It's true.
I feel like people used to. Like sometimes I read in the kind of books that I read, people are like, everybody knows this. I'm like, I don't know that everybody knows this.
No, I didn't learn this stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's a reminder that the past, I think this is one of the most fascinating things about it. The past is just as complex as the present. We often think, oh, the English, they've been in Britain forever. The English have been in Britain for 1,500 years, right? Or the English language has been in Britain for 1,500 years. I don't want to get into population questions again. I'm not a geneticist, although I interview them. The language has been in Britain for 1,500 years. You would not expect, if not for the revelations of linguistics and lately archaeogenetics, that there had been this huge invasion, both of Europe and India, by these people from out in the grasslands of Ukraine 5,000 years ago, and that had totally restructured the populations of two continents. Right? That's weird. We would not know that because they didn't write anything, so that we don't have stories from them. We just have that signature in the language and in the genetics, and to a certain extent traceable by archaeology.
Fascinating.
The past is complex, just as complex as the present, and no doubt this story, which has gone over the last 5,000 years, no doubt there are just as complex stories the 5,000 years before that, and the 5,000 years before that, and the 5,000 years before that. And I think that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I appreciate you folks. If you enjoy this kind of topic, this channel is full of videos, and I've referred to a few of them from time to time throughout this video. I'll try to remember to put some links to them in pinned comment below. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, I'll wish you all the best.